So, as per usual with a panel, let's just introduce ourselves real quick and what we're building. I know some of you have already done the talk, but good to do that again, if that's okay. Maybe start from the end there.
Yeah, so I'm NorthSwap, and I build HappyChain, as you just heard about. It's a L2 gaming chain that aims to make onboarding super easy for users and integration easy for devs.
Hey everyone, I'm Terrence. I'm one of the co-founders of Cartridge, building Dojo, one of the co-creators of Dope Wars. I've been building fully on-chain games and towards this idea of autonomous worlds for about 2.5 years now. Yeah, that's me.
Hello everyone, my name is Scott. I'm the founder of Argus Labs. We are building the World Engine, which is an on-chain game roll-up framework designed with execution sharding to allow you to horizontally scale your games with low latency and geo-localized shards.
My name is Billy. I'm the founder of Trifle Labs. It's a new on-chain game company. Prior to that, I was in charge of the Cosmos Network Foundation, Interchain Foundation, and the Cosmos Hub lead. But I began in the space building games with Clover's Network back in 2017.
Okay, perfect. I'll start off with a bit of a softball question here. So, how do autonomous worlds and fully on-chain games actually push the boundaries of what's possible in gaming? And can you give some concrete examples? I know we just saw some very good examples of this, but if you would elaborate on this. Maybe, yeah, because you just went as well.
Damn, I was trying to find something a little bit different. Which one's my favorite? I think what excites me the most is user-generated content and the ability for players to create in these games very easily, and then maybe even pay for the user-generated content or have that become like sort of the center of focus of a game. I don't think that's what draw people to a game in the first place, but it's sort of the end game that I'm most excited about.
Yeah, I definitely agree with user-generated content on top of these type of open platforms that are enabled by the blockchain, where you have like extensibility, composability, and permissionlessness by default, and you remove the platform risk of centralized providers. Just enables much more interesting types of ecosystems to build on top of them. Like in the traditional gaming space, we've never seen the ability, or it's rare for the ability for someone to invest in someone building a game on top of someone else's game, because there's too much platform risk associated with that. With fully on-chain game autonomous worlds, that's completely different, right? You can build on top of anyone else's game with very strong guarantees that the foundation will remain there. And then I think along with that is like very interesting monetization strategies that you can start to integrate, because like financial rails are embedded directly in the blockchain. You can, as a user-generated content contributor, you can monetize at so many different levels depending on how the platform decides to integrate this. Like you can have low-level primitives that can be composed together, and revenues from a game can flow to multiple different creators very easily, and that can be scaled in a way that was never possible before.
I'm very tempted to just like say the same thing with different words, but like I think they already covered like all of the things that I would say with regards to the interoperability and composability primitives of like fully on-chain games. So I'll try to come up with a kind of more creative answer. So my take here is that fully on-chain games bring back the fucking around and finding out era back to like multiplayer games, because previously, like when we were talking about like these like game servers, like a lot of these technologies are built in like early 2000s, and they have been like the same for almost like 2 decades. Some of the like largest game servers out there are still run in this like Windows server that you can't like run in anywhere else. You have these Windows OS, and like it was just like these like headless Unity client and like all of that. So these are really archaic technology. There has very little and very few of like innovations in between. And like what fully on-chain does is really kind of like bring back this energy of like trying to unlock new primitives from these games through like, again, distributed systems, through cryptography, through a like novel virtual machine runtime environment that allows you you build more cool features using composability. And I think what most exciting to me is actually to introduce more like like a larger range of freedoms into these massively multiplayer online games. As MMO game designers, we often talk about the degrees of freedom in an MMO game, and like fully on-chain games is really kind of the end game, or like I would say like the magnum like opus, like imaginations of a lot of MMO game designers, where you don't have any limitations on what you can actually do and what kind of emergent behaviors can form on top of your fully on-chain games. So not only there will be emergent strategy or emergent meta gameplay or like min-max strategies for your game, you will also have an interesting economic emergent behavior where people could be building their own banks, they can be building their own guilds, they could be creating their own marketplaces. And all of this will, I think at the end of the day, increases the potential maximum GDP of of a massively multiplayer online game that have in the past been limited due to constraints that the game developers created upon their own users.
It's a long list of things. I actually have kind of two reasons why I think it's an exciting space to build on, and both of those reasons went into the name that I chose for the org, Trifle. So the first one comes from this play theorist named Bernard Suits, and it's basically a player matrix, which says that players who play with the rules and play with the objectives, that's the norm, that's a normal player. Players who play with the objective to win, but with different rules are cheaters. They've basically modified the rules or ignored them, but they still preserve the objective. Spoil Sport throws out both. They walk right through the magic circle. But there's a fourth quadrant, and that's called a trifler. And a trifler preserves the rules of a game, but for a different objective. And I think that that's really at the core of what is interesting inside these spaces. It's also like at the core of the hacker ethos. You know, this was built for a completely different purpose, but if I look at it this way and think of something else to do with it, I can use that entire structure for a different purpose, and I can build on top of it and make something completely novel. So that's the trifler, where trifle comes from. But the other one, of course, is just a trifle is like something a little meaningless, something silly. It's a toy. And I think we all know that some of the most transformative technology begins looking like toys. So I thought beginning with toys is probably the most important way to sort of work in an industry in which we're trying to make transformative tech.
Okay, yeah, those are all very good examples. I think interoperability and composability is something, of course, everyone immediately thinks of. But then I think back of a tweet, I think it was 2-3 days ago, of someone that said, has anyone already managed to bring their sword into another game? So are people, do you think, really waiting on this? And if so, how can we actually achieve this in a manner that is quite seamless for users? Anyone wants to take this?
Yeah, I think I'll take this one. I think the whole taking this sword to another game is made by marketers in the 2018. They've never really thought about composability and crypto games, and now we're stuck with this joke about this sword being bring to another game. And technically speaking, this is not a problem. These are technically trivial, but there are good game design reasons why you don't want to bring a sword from World of Warcraft to EVE Online, for example, right? And so when we're talking about composability and interoperability in the context of a fully on-chain games, we often think about it more towards how existing game players can build on top of the existing game and kind of expand the existing game ecosystem instead of trying to bring over swords from a different game which has completely different physics and rule sets and might not even be compatible, right? Sure, things like cosmetics you can do and it's very trivial, but I think the whole idea of kind of bringing these swords is somewhat of kind of a distraction, and I think there are more interesting things that you can do by kind of allowing the players to extend the gameplay environment using smart contracts and let's say building kind of these banks or building these cooperative systems within the game, creating systems let's say a mercenary market or something like that, without having to ask a game developer for permission, oh, I want to add this feature. So to summarize, it's I think composability in the context of a fully on-chain game will kind of start being from within the game itself, and then maybe as the fully on-chain game space matures, you're going to have these on-chain game publishers, and these on-chain game publishers could coordinate interoperability perhaps in their portfolio games and from different game studios under their umbrella, and then I think a lot of these interoperability across random games, I think is more of a pie in the sky, and I think it's oftentimes kind of more a party trick, and less so about being practical and relevant to fully on-chain game developers and players.
I think there's also this kind of cart before the horse aspect of it. So if you look at that level of composability as being similar to user-generated content, you still need to create value in the game to have that initial player base, to have them invest enough interest, care, and value to care about moving it somewhere else. If you build Minecraft without the actual playable game, you don't have a successful product. Like, you have to have a game which is fun inside of there to build up the community, to build up the value, to build up the interest in making user-generated content.
And I'll add just one thing that we've noticed inside of the Dojo ecosystem, where we have the Loot Realms ecosystem, or that are producing a bunch of different games that are within the same lore. But even within there, and even though like Dojo as an engine is designed to be natively extensible and composable, most of these teams are building their own like instances of the Realms world with their games inside of it, because it's too early on to kind of ossify these like foundational layers and start to share them. And I think, to Billy's point, like once there is something very successful that has a lot of attention and has value, then that will essentially like ossify as like and become the canonical implementation for a particular lore that everyone else will start building on top of, to have exposure to that audience that lives already inside of that world. Until that exists, there's not a whole, like a super compelling reason to basically take on the dependency of other teams like during this very early iterative phase of development, where you want to have a lot of velocity, because it definitely slows things down a lot.
I got absolutely nothing to add. I agree with everything. Okay,
perfect. We were talking here about indeed cart before the horse and those types of things. So if so, are there still some cultural or technological gaps that still exist that we would need to solve before we can realize the full potential, of course, of what we're discussing here today?
Yeah. What do you mean?
What are they? Yeah.
Every single talk today was about those problems.
Yeah, so what is, in your opinion, the most important one?
Well, I think I think I'll answer this question by not answering the question.
Wonderful.
And I think again, the way that I think about video games is kind of like an artist, right? I think you don't really ask an artist what color of paints don't exist yet. You just don't know until you have to paint something, and then you realize, oh, I don't have this color ink, or I don't have these paint, or I don't have these type of brush that I want to have to achieve a certain stroke or a certain look, right? So from a perspective of game developers, it's all tools in the toolbox, and so the more canvas, the larger the canvas that you have, the more variety of brushes, the more powerful that your brushes or your medium, etc., or your tools, the more kind of games that you're able to build, right? And so I think right now we're at the point with fully on-chain games where a lot of the problems are really kind of basically solving the table stakes problem that is already solved with Web 2 games, right? So in my talk, I talk about scaling to tens of thousands of users, these geo latency and time to action and all of that, having these fast block times, improving the developer experience, etc. All of these things are table stakes problem that currently exists in fully on-chain games when, let's say, someone that brings in the mental model of, let's say, their Web 2 development and they're facing these issues, they want to have these things solved because otherwise you'll feel constrained in the kind of things that you're building, right? And this have always been the topic for any on-chain game developers out there is if someone wants to create a new game, before you even think about what game you want to build, you're already so frustrated thinking about the constraints that you're going to have when you're building a fully on-chain game. And I think that's one of the key priority that we have at Argus when we're building the World Engine is to reduce significantly the amount of constraints. And then after that, this is when you will see new primitives start flourishing and people being able to chase their creative freedom to the fullest extent. But yeah.
I think even deciding which problems are worth solving is, of course, one of the most important steps in that. And it's why we found it really important to be, first and foremost, a game studio over a platform or necessarily an infrastructure project.
Oh, yes.
You need to have a really tight feedback cycle between, I'm trying to make this game and I want to make it fun. What do I need to make that happen? And that should inform the sort of technical decisions. I think it's always tempting to sort of build out ahead, assuming that you know what people want, especially in the blockchain space. And I think it's really dangerous. And so I think that what's the most important tech thing is actually most relevant to the specific game that you're trying to make. In my talk, I talked about most of the games we see today are essentially digital board games, which is great. I wonder how many of those were sort of retrofitted into the fact that those are the only kinds of games you can make. But if you really want to make a board game and you begin with that, actually we're kind of ready for you.
Yeah, I would divide the issues in 3 buckets. The first one is onboarding, because I think we have games today that are pretty fun, but struggle to find their audience because it's just too hard to get playing. And that's why at Happy Chain we're focusing on building this onboarding first. The second one is scaling, because once you reach a certain amount of player, the current technology we have doesn't scale. I think onboarding is more important because onboarding is a problem of finding success. Scaling is a problem. When you have success, then you have to solve that. And then the third one, which maybe sometimes gets less attention, is sort of death by 1,000 paper cuts. So we have a lot of tech that's kind of there, but not really. And you realize there's a lot of limitation that you're not aware of. So it's going to take you 1 week, 2 weeks to integrate something that should have taken a few hours. And you multiply that by 10 or 15 for everything you need, and suddenly you've spent 6 months just building support for your game and not really like the game itself.
Yeah, I think my perspective is, I think, we're all obviously very focused on the technical side of things right now because it's the easiest to talk about. And I think we have pretty tractable solutions, and it's a matter of execution to be able to scale, the execution context of blockchains to support these kind of experiences. I think if you look historically at games, every platform shift has been driven by some distribution innovation, and all of the work that we're doing rests on the assumption that there is some distribution innovation enabled through the blockchain. And I think that there definitely is something with cryptoeconomic incentives to solve a really critical problem for games, which is basically this cold start problem of being able to attract players to reach some critical mass to turn it into a sustainable game. But we're so early in the phase of building on-chain games that no one has really even started to experiment with how can we start to use these cryptoeconomic primitives that are only enabled by the blockchain to kind of solve this and build some unique distribution advantage, which is going to be really critical because things like the App Store or the Steam and consoles are entirely hostile to on-chain games or any crypto-enabled applications, and it might be a while before they kind of come around to that. So we need to have something incredibly compelling to build new distribution channels through web, through progressive web apps, where users is a strong enough value proposition that they're willing to kind of go around existing structures to interact with these experiences. So I think that's in my opinion, probably the final horseman, the biggest challenge that we ultimately all need to figure out how to solve before we can be successful.
Well, can I just speak for a second on the topic of distribution? I think it's really interesting. I've heard that a lot, and I imagine it's true that all the phase changes in gaming is always, with an update in distribution. And I agree that I think we have that opportunity, and I think we've seen it partially, but I don't think we've seen it taken advantage of enough. And one of the goals for our first game is actually that it'll be fully on chain, so you can take advantage of third-party marketplaces as an interface to the game. One of the other framings for on-chain games I really like are client-agnostic games. The core logic lives somewhere immutable and accessible, but the way you access it is sort of up to the user or variable, or you can imagine as many different ways to it. And so trying to sort of begin with a game that there's the default way to access it, sure, it's our domain, et cetera, but having it hooked into this alternative distribution method, which we already do have through NFT metadata, was a really exciting concept that I would love to see sort of explored further, and we hope to push too.
I'm glad you guys touched upon distribution and also about things like the Apple Store, where there's a lot of censorship and a lot of moderation. But of course, that then brings into perspective the other side of fully on-chain games, where you want to be very decentralized, but you also don't want to allow certain things to happen. We see this also now with AI agents, marketplaces, and so on. So what is your perspective on the battle between moderation and decentralization, and how do you plan to tackle that, if you want to tackle that at all?
I think decentralization can solve that as well, in the sense that you could have a protocol that's on-chain that is fully neutral, doesn't censor anything, but then on the front-end side, you can host different front-end, different interfaces to access the same content that then can have their own filtering and censorship guidelines. So yeah.
I don't think this. People often pose this as like a unique problem to the blockchain, and I think it's not. It's like a problem everywhere, right? You see it on Twitter where they have like dedicated engineers trying to filter scammers, and the scammers just move faster than them. So I think like there is actually a competitive advantage in the decentralized context with autonomous worlds and having these open ecosystems that your community can start to innovate on filters to apply to like the event stream or whatever to curate what is the interesting components and remove the spam from a particular type of experience, and that could like manifest in identities and reputations and all these types of things to kind of gate and find smaller communities within an ecosystem that you want to interact with, or new clients that are built on top of this. And even in the context of AI and machine learning and bots, like I recently saw, I think it was GDC last year, they now have computer monitors with computer vision algorithms built directly into them. So they're just, now you're even with existing approaches to anti-cheat where you're kind of monitoring like the runtime and trying to see modifications to the binary. This is just layered entirely on top of the game. It's impossible to detect by any of the existing anti-cheat software. So I think this can become a bigger and a bigger problem in the future for everyone. And yeah, it's certainly an interesting question. I don't have a good
maybe
answer.
Maybe to challenge it a bit, like the anti-cheat, right? So those types of models, they are centralized and off-chain, of course, let's be honest. They don't want to open source that at all. If that is all on-chain, don't you then expect certain, even AI models and so on to be able to circumvent that in a way, to go around that? If everything is truly on-chain, how do you then prevent that?
I think it will be reactive. I mean, I think that anti-cheat as it exists today for traditional games is like a low-level process happening at the binary level, trying to detect like modifications to the game's runtime, right? When you have cheating software that essentially just emulates a human and how they interact with a computer, it becomes like almost impossible to detect. And then you have to look at probability distributions and try and have like some statistical methods to filter these things out. I think the same will be true in the blockchain context. You have all this open information. The communities can come around and figure out like this. The particular run was way out of distribution, and we want to provide more scrutiny to it. I think it's an interesting open area of innovation where all this information being public allows people to kind of define, what they want to be a part of the meta and allowed to be happen inside of a particular instance of a game or an interpretation of like an autonomous world. And you can essentially just throw away a lot of the things that you don't want to interact with.
Yeah, I pretty much agree. I think some game models are never going to be a great fit for a blockchain. Like a first-person shooter, it's going to be difficult to know that someone is not using an aimbot. Like Terence said, you need statistics, and it's quite difficult. There are some things you can do, but I think it's not going to be the strongest fit. So we should focus on games that have more moving pieces, and where these machine learning models we have today can't really learn the thing because it's just moving too fast underneath it. And I think that can lead to some very interesting game design decisions as well.
Well, I think my synthesis out of all of this is the best part of fully on-chain games is basically letting the market or kind of the community itself create a shelling point and create your own kind of basically agreement in terms of this is basically going to be the canonical marketplace, or kind of this is the primary way we're going to get this game client or gameplay to the hands of the users, instead of having to go through this top-down oligopoly of Epic Game Store, Apple, or Google, etc. Right? And we're already kind of even seeing this market structure being shift even in traditional games itself, right? So if you guys play games, you'll notice that a lot of more and more game publishers are starting to make their own game launcher, right? Back in the days, everyone just installs Steam, and that's how you get all of your games. But with modern game publishers like Riot and Bethesda, all of that, increasingly they are building their own launchers, and because they want to have the power to define their own rule sets, they want to have capabilities to modify and distribute their games in a way that they want to distribute it, and maybe they want to have a different take rates on the fees, etc. They want to make it easier for their players to trade their items, so on and so forth, by having their own rules. And I think that this is already kind of the natural way that the game industry is going to shift of with like more and more indie game companies not wanting to kind of basically be stuck in the kind of the rules that they didn't create, they will kind of like prefer to actually have more options and being able to actually let the community decide which like distribution mechanism or which like platform or like app store that they want to use, and therefore agree on a shared kind of like rule set and constraints they want for the games, right? So as like we previously discussed, there might be some games like for example, one of the games that one of my friends made, like Kamigochi, willingly just like embrace like bots and like all of these AIs and whatsoever, because they've designed their games to like allow these bots and AI to proliferate, and it's a part of the gameplay itself, right? But like some games, like example what Norswap said, like Counter-Strike, a first-person shooter, they probably don't want as much like bots and AI, like just like playing the games instead of the users, right? And so, like yeah, I think like the best part about fully on-chain games or crypto games broadly is to allow the players and like for these new market structures to exist instead of it being prescribed to the game developers.
The bot question is really interesting. I think we could probably do a whole panel on it. But I kind of see it in maybe like 3 different areas. The first sort of accelerates all the way into just bots versus bots. All games have to be built bot native. We have Robot War TV shows. Why not bot games? The question then just becomes, what games are entertaining enough to watch bots play each other? If you think about like basketball, humans have a pretty good idea of how hard it is to play basketball, even if they don't do it very frequently. So when you watch a professional, you're like, wow, that was really cool. So we have to like find sports or games that like it's actually entertaining to watch bot versus bot. The other side is, oh God, my mind's going a little blank. Well, you can always kind of try to remove the incentives. So basically, bots have been able to beat games for a while, right? People still play games because games are fun. You don't necessarily have to play at the highest level of competition to enjoy a game. I do puzzles all the time. I know that I could solve this puzzle with a computer. I know that I could look up the answer, but I still spend the time doing it. So I think that there's still a lot of opportunities for games like that. Of course, it opens up the question, well, what's the point of being on a blockchain anymore? Where's the incentive mechanism? Where is all this coming from? But the same way that advertising was a solution for content, it's just getting someone's attention. I think we have a lot more opportunities to monetize attention in ways that aren't as specifically as extractive as advertising. Oh, I know. The third one, of course, is going in the entire different direction, which is that the only truly equitable way to allow players and bots to participate with each other is if random number generators are involved. And then you're basically fully in the casino mode, which is maybe not terrible as well, because that random number generator also has a lever. It can be fully turned on, and then you have a slot machine, or it can be somewhere in the middle, and then you have backgammon or poker, things like that. Things that destabilize still make it possible for humans to have fun playing against a bot, who, on average, may beat them over time, but the idea that you beat a player that's better than you is so exciting, and it's still enough to, like, I think, get you in that arena when you know you have a chance.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe a small side question, and you said randomness. How do you, and unpredictability, how can you include that fully on-chain without, and while still maintaining fully on-chain verifiability?
I feel like that's a perfect question for this conference, because it's just, we're going to engineer away that way. That one, they'll just go away. Good. It'll be solved through some techniques. There's new techniques, there's other techniques. I don't think that it's unsolvable.
But it's important, right, to have this,
for
sure. This on-chain.
I think like the randomness part is like, I think at this point fairly solvable. Like Norswap, I think, is working on randomness stuff. But like there are things like verifiable random functions, for example, that allows you to have randomness on chain. So this was an issue if you were in 2018, 2017 Solidity era, where like
100%.
Chainlink doesn't exist and like whatever, and all you have is block timestamp to seed entropy. Then you're kind of like at the hands of the block producers who actually give you randomness. But like these days, I think there are like a lot of primitives to like solve randomness. The key kind of question that is left is like, how fast can we produce randomness is like the part that I think a lot of infrastructure are like working towards, especially for games, because like if you want to like, let's say, have like randomness happening at every like, let's say sub-millisecond, on like a millisecond level, then you can't have like a verifiable random function that like submits the randomness to the blockchain only like once every 15 seconds, for example. So like, yeah, but I think like for randomness, like one of the, I guess, like the more easily solvable problems within fully on-chain games. Okay,
maybe then turning it more into a positive thing around AI and bots. earlier this morning, Stanley from Lens was talking about how AI can help them do also some moderation. For example, as you said, I think Darren's community could, for example, vote on certain parameters and they would just scrape it, right? Do you see other opportunities for AI agents? I know that everyone is hyping up AI as if it's the second coming of whatever, right? But do you think that we will see this in the near future, where AI agents will be shaping these autonomous on-chain worlds?
I think there's a lot of interesting intersections between on-chain worlds or autonomous worlds and on-chain games and AI. The one that I'm actually most particularly excited about is just raising the level of abstraction so that people can contribute to these through like generating code or assets and stuff, like more offline processes that introduce content into the world. I think autonomous agents or AI agents on-chain, in my opinion, is not really practical at the scale that you need to make interesting experiences right now. Just like verifying the execution of the models that you want to use is just not practical. Definitely not with ZK, and you can do some stuff with optimistic stuff, but it introduces like a lot of additional complexity to the stack. I mean, I do think that there's much simpler models that you can, there's a lot of tooling now being built around taking models from like PyTorch or something, exporting them to be run on chain, and there's a lot of stuff you can do with just much simpler models as well inside of games. But yeah, I think it's like a interesting new space opening up. I'm mostly focused on how people can contribute with it.
I guess like one thing that I'm like somewhat, I think I am somewhat annoyed by a lot of these like the rise of the LLMs are kind of like assuming that AI agents can only be achieved through like these like arbitrary large language model, when like Tron, which is an arcade game from the 1970s, have AI, but it's just not like an AI agent powered by large language models, which is like basically bringing a bazooka into like a knife fight, right? And realistically here, like, game state machines are like one of those things that are very easy to model for a computer. And based on the heuristics of these, like, of the game state, you can actually build, an AI to a part of the game itself that you don't need to rely on these like large execution model and all of that. These large language models are going to be great for, let's say, if you want to generate quests, which is like one of the things that I'm most fascinated by, based on this like anime that I really like, and I named my company after, called Sword Art Online, where you can have AI to generate new content for the game, etc. But not necessarily as like, like you're replacing the AI bots that is like playing within those games, right? That can be like easily encoded as a part of like the tick runtime. That if your chain of choice, if you use the world engine, you can have like kind of bots encoded into the block like transition function and all of that, and that will allow you to have like NPC and bots that are like running around your game in real time, and all of this doesn't really need to rely on like fancy large language models which are a black box. You can just use like dumb if-else statement, right? Like you don't need a large language models to create a bot to play like, I don't know, like a tic-tac-toe game. You can just like write this with if-else statements. And so that's like kind of basically, I think, the part that I think like when everyone's talking about AI agents or like AI in general in the context of games, like people's like I think the natural way of doing that is through like decades of like how we've built in-game AIs. And I think like I think large language models, or like what people these days call AI agents, are I think like going to introduce some new dimensions for like storytelling and so on and so forth, but I think less so for the actual like gameplay itself. And yeah, I guess that's my hot take.
I'm generally more bearish on AI than other people, but I'm really curious where it will go. I think there's potential, and there's something we talked about. So there's like bots that already exist for games. Like how can we leverage them? Can we like watch them? Is that fun? Can we maybe use them as part of a strategy where every bot is a different strategy in an underlying game, and then there's a broader game on top of it where you select the various strategies that you want. I would be really excited with agents that are like autonomous and they create this world that is moving without you. I think today it's just too easy to just hijack the bots and make them do some bullshit. But you could even do that in a way that's not at all like driven by the technical innovation of the last few years. And there are some people doing that just an enormous amount of work, but just like a rule engine that says, when you piss this person off, this NPC off, then your reputation lowers, and then it has all kinds of repercussions that are just like really normal code. It just gets involved pretty fast. I know some Web2 games are doing that. One of those is like super horrendous, like ASCII graphics, kind of thing. There's also Dwarf Fortress, which is also horrendous graphics, but that's another one that's very famous. And yeah, I'd be excited if we could have that technology. There were some people working on it back in the day, but I don't think it went anywhere.
That question makes me think of the use of AI or large language models in two different ways. One is like LLMs as a game space, which I think are really interesting. I played a game recently where you are basically trying to convince an LLM to, reveal their name, like Rumpelstiltskin. It's like such a really bizarre, diverse player space to work with. So I'm actually bullish on verification of LLMs on chain too, just from seeing some of the updates in the last years. So I don't think it's that far off to think that like these extremely versatile lore-based LLMs could be actual player environments with the right prompt can be really interesting, and the actual aspects of it still, private as necessary on chain. And then the other direction is basically the bot wars thing, right? So you have that possibility going in that direction. Of course, this is like kind of scary if you're a game developer and you're trying to preserve the human player aspect of it. But I had a conversation with somebody yesterday who was asking me about like, I want to make this library of models that are good at playing games, and people like maybe a library for them. And the first thing that I thought of was like, actually, I almost built a bot while developing our game, because end-to-end testing with a game is so difficult. You end up sort of having to build a bot if you want to be able to test your game in any sort of complicated method. And of course, then you're like, am I giving in and making this evil thing that, I'm going to try to contain it inside my repository and hope nobody ever gets a copy of it because they'll be able to use it against me or something? But if you let go of that fear, I think it's like an extremely useful tool possibly to have like an LLM or a trained model on your game's logic to be able to actually use it in testing environments. And then you take that a step further and you can do the entire playtest cycle if you have a model which is able to interact with your game. Playtests are one of the most important parts of making a game, and it does not scale. You have to sit down and you have to really interact with that person playing the game. And that person also has to be like fresh to your game. You kind of can't do it twice on the same person. So the idea that you could have like an infinite number of completely fresh, naive playtesters go through and massively run through your game and give you back feedback, like this is just way too easy, way too hard, totally confusing. I'm an idiot LLM, but I should be able to do it. Like that's a really exciting development for not necessarily on-chain gaming, but games and models themselves.
Fully agree, actually. So we're running almost out of time. I just want to have one more question. Panels often get like this reputation of everyone is agreeing with each other all the time, and it doesn't add value. So I would like to just ask you, after now we're almost at the end of EthCC, the entire week, what is the most controversial opinion you have after this week that people can come up to you afterwards and ask you about? I know it's a difficult question, so...
We should never host a conference in Brussels again.
As a Belgian, I would agree.
We should never host a conference in Brussels again.
I don't think that's controversial.
My bad.
I actually don't think it's controversial here, but I think premature decentralization is the root of all evil.
That is not controversial.
Yeah, I guess it's probably not controversial either, but I think like there needs to be a much stronger focus on actually like bringing interesting experiences to users and not just building, we have so much over-provisioned capacity at the infrastructure level now, like searching for someone for like, 1 gigabyte blocks and, these type of things. We need people to actually use this stuff now. So I think it should be a more increasingly important focus.
Well, I guess the one thing I say all the time is we can get normal people to play on-chain games, and some people agree, but quite a lot of people disagree. So I would say that's my spicy opinion.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and that's
thanks for moderating.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good day. So bye.